Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Arden Hegley, the co-organizer of this series, Medical Humanities and Pandemic Urbanisms, at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. We are delighted to welcome you back to our series celebrating the new undergraduate major in Medical Humanities here at Columbia. Many thanks for all those who have returned from events in previous weeks. We're so glad to have you with us as we resume our series tonight. Now, as we're holding events on Zoom, I know we're all in different places and this panel is coming from different nations, but Columbia is a real place, and this event is being hosted at Columbia, which resides on the Lenape-Hoking, which is the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. Tonight's panel is titled Homesick, Reimagining Indoor-Outdoor Space in the Pandemic. The conversation builds on our series' ongoing interrogation of how the pandemic has revealed fractures and fissures in our society, with a special attention to the design of urban space, both indoor and outdoor. Tonight's event is supported by the Temple Hoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture. Our moderator is Reinhold Martin, Professor of Architecture in Columbia GSAPP and the Director of the Buell Center. And he will begin tonight by introducing our panelists. Welcome, Professor Martin.
Thank you, Arden, and welcome to all this wonderful evening. It's my privilege to introduce three amazing colleagues from different corners of our shared intellectual universe. And I'm going to do that just right now at the beginning, the two speakers and the respondent, and then we'll go right through the program in that way. And then we'll pick up the questions in the Q&A after the response. So to begin, my colleague Annmarie Adams, who joins us from Montreal as the chair of the Department of Social Science, Studies in Medicine at McGill University, educated as an architect and an architectural historian at UC Berkeley. Annmarie jointly teaches in McGill's School of Architecture and the Department of Social Studies of Medicine there. So Professor Adams is the author of a number of important and widely referenced books in the field of architectural history as it intersects the history of medicine and society, beginning with Architecture in the Family Way, Doctors, Houses, and Women, 1870 to 1900 from 1996, Medicine by Design, The Architect and the Modern Hospital, 1893 to 1943 in 2008, and co-author of Designing Women, Gender and the Architectural Profession, from 2000. Recent awards include the Faculty of Engineering's Christophe Pierre Award for Research Excellence at McGill, 2016, and the President's Award for Excellence in Media the following year, 2017, from the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada. Professor Adams's research focuses on how medicine, gender, and architecture intersect. So, the sort of perfect opening speaker for this panel, mostly in houses and hospitals. In her current work includes an SSHRC-funded spatial biography of cardiologist and museum curator Maud Abbott, and she's overseeing the future reuse, this is a fascinating project, of the former Royal Victoria Hospital site in Montreal. And Professor Adams will be followed by Charles Branas, who is the chair of epidemiology at Columbia University. Dr. Branas has conducted research that extends from urban and rural areas in the US to communities across the globe, incorporating place-based interventions and human geography. He's led win-win science that generates new knowledge while simultaneously creating positive real-world changes and providing health-enhancing resources for local communities. His pioneering work on geographic access to medical care has changed the healthcare landscape, leading to the designation of new hospitals and a series of national scientific replications in the US and other countries for many conditions, such as trauma, cancer, stroke, and so on. His research on the geography and factors underpinning gun violence has been cited by landmark Supreme Court decisions by Congress and by the NIH director. With community partners Dr. Branas led the first citywide randomized control trials to transform vacant lots. So medicine and urbanism, again, very appropriate to the panel, to transform vacant lots and abandoned buildings as sustainable solutions to improving health and safety, including reductions in gun violence. He's worked internationally on 4 continents and led multinational efforts, producing extensive cohorts of developing nation scientists, national health metrics, and worldwide press coverage. So the presentations by Annmarie Adams and Charles Branas will be followed by a response by my colleague here at Columbia at GSAPP, Laura Kurgan, who is professor of architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation here or there, wherever Columbia may be these days, where indeed she directs, and this I'm saying this because of Laura's work, where she directs the Center for Spatial Research, an incredibly innovative research center at GSAPP, as well as the visual studies curriculum that in many ways transfers the wisdom of the CSR into the curriculum. She's the author of Close Up at a Distance, Mapping Technology and Politics of 2013, and co-editor of Ways of Knowing Cities of 2019. From 2004 to 2015, she founded and directed the Spatial Information Design Lab at GSAPP, and now the Center for Spatial Research. Her work explores the ethics and politics of digital mapping and its technologies, the art, science, and visualization of big and small data, and design environments for public engagement with maps and data. Her work's been exhibited internationally at the Chicago Architectural Biennial quite recently in 2019, and at the Venice Architectural Biennial 2018, among many other venues, and is in the permanent collections of the Museum of Modern Art here in New York, the Fondation Cartier in Paris. Current topics in Laura's research at the CSR include justice mapping, conflict urbanism, spatial inequality, algorithms and social justice, and indeed, historical New York City. So with those introductions, I cede the screen to Annmarie Adams, who's going to begin the evening's presentations, and I very much look forward to the conversations that will follow. Welcome.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's so great to be among these colleagues tonight. And my plan is to speak for about 15 minutes and show a number of slides. I'd like to present, I thought what I'd do is present 5 points, basically things I've been observing about the changing relationship of architecture and space over the past year, the pandemic year. And these come mostly from recent blogs that I've written and from discussions like the one we're having tonight on COVID. And because I'm an architectural historian, I'll use 1 or 2 pieces of architectural or photographic evidence for each of my 5 points. And you see my 5 points on the screen now. I like to start by making an open admission, and that is that I've simplified my positions, my points a bit to make them more provocative, just to inspire our discussion. And also, I would also like to admit that I think all of these things are kind of obvious. And I'd like to give a photo credit that quite a few of my images tonight, 9 out of my 14 images, are taken from publication the New York Times 2020 in Photos, which was published on the 8th of December in 2020. So my point number 1, I hope you can see that well, is about the interior. I think what has happened, this is something I've written quite a bit about, is that interiors have become more important, obviously, because we're all confined at home. And I wrote about this. This is my house where I'm sitting right now, showing in this blog. I wrote about this on one of my favorite feminist architecture websites, Parlor, Women, Equity and Architecture from Australia, and it's gotten quite a bit of attention. Obvious because our own worlds are suddenly so contained, I think we're willing to invest more in them. So more time, more money, more study will be devoted to interiors post 2020. We've already seen that playing out in academic conferences and publications, and the SAH has had it has a new affiliate group, and it has dedicated a lot of energy to the interior this year. So also obvious is that our houses have become our workplaces, our schools, and in the case of my own family, a dance studio, because our daughter is a dancer. So for many of us, our homes are now the only places in our lives. So in architecture, I think this is a huge idea, that places might matter less, and that purpose-built architecture may lose its purpose. That place is now less meaningful than before COVID. And I've been really thinking about that a lot. My point number 2 is that Victorian middle-class houses have proven to be the best for pandemic life. You may think of me, and certainly from Reinhold's introduction too, as someone who studies hospital, but I actually got my start in my career studying houses, and I still dabble in this a lot. I wrote my UC Berkeley dissertation, as mentioned, on sickness in the Victorian home, and then it became this book that came out in 1996, which is amazing that it was 25 years ago. So the book has had a renaissance this year. And the reason the Victorian house plan works so well, and again, this is so obvious, at least it seems so to me, is because it has separate rooms, discrete circulation. You can close yourself off, unlike, for example, in the Parisian apartment with its enfilade plan. So relatedly, there's been something of a COVID awakening for this work that I did a long time ago, that my stuff after 25 years is suddenly interesting to journalists. And as I mentioned, we had an SAH Connects event where we hospital historians actually talked about this sudden visibility we have after being quite invisible in architectural history for so long. Now, my third point is the concept of designing for sickness, and I think that is key. So until World War II, I would contend houses were designed for sickness, and then that stopped. They had designated spaces. They were called out on floor plans. It's usually called the sick room. On the left, you see one of my favorite paintings by Edvard Munch, the Norwegian painter, the painter of the screen. It's called Death in the Sick Room from 1895. And then on the right, you see one of these photos from the New York Times, a year in photos, a COVID patient at home in Italy. And you see how remarkably similar they are. There are tons and tons of Victorian paintings of this important space, the sick room. But the images from 2020 are remarkably similar. There's always a bed, a person in the bed, a religious image, a mix of medical, religious, and family figures. And so the point here, I don't really know why, but this vignette still signifies sickness at home. My next point is about empty space. And our event tonight is about reimagining indoor and outdoor space. So my point number 4, and this isn't my original idea, but I think it's correct and it's significant. And that is that the new importance of interiors is amplified by media images of empty space. So at a discussion forum with global mayors, I think it took place in October, the mayor of Milan talked about this subconscious impact on us being flooded every day with images of familiar public places, but now empty. So we've never seen these places empty during the day. And I'm not sure they are as empty as the photos show. So this photo on the screen now is of Montreal, where I live, of the area we call Place des Arts. And I think it's about the right amount of empty. If I walked there right now, there would be this many people. And yet the images we see, for example, in the year in photos are almost completely empty. So this is 4 examples from around the world of what I mean by this genre of images of hauntingly empty public space. My final point, and point 5, this is about the changing view of hospital space. And I have a couple of things to say about this. This is a longer point. A very big tension is in hospital design, as many of you probably know, and I've worked a lot on this, is this belief that good hospitals should look like homes. So the less a hospital looks like an institution, whatever that means, the better the care is. And I myself am not a believer in this. I've been an outspoken critic of this belief. And I'm hoping that it has been somewhat discredited by COVID. So a related subpoint is that the hospital, I think, during COVID has emerged as the opposite of a refuge. That the hospital has been seen as a point of refuge since about 1880, a safe place to go, a place to get healed. And it's no longer seen that way, and it's very destabilizing. So on the screen now is a diagram of this idea from an article by Laura Spinney of The Guardian, published in early 2021, and I thought it was one of the best things written about the future hospital. So the big architectural difference, of course, is that in the post-COVID hospital, and we see that in these temporary hospitals, walls don't work and they don't matter. The evidence that walls don't matter is that we have basically returned to a pavilion plan arrangement of Nightingale wards, like in the 19th century hospital, that only air and space now separates these beds. So the new hospital wall, the missing wall, is PPE, personal protective equipment, as we all know. Now, most of us didn't know what PPE was a year ago. And instead of containing illness with walls, which is what hospital walls have done since about 1920, healthcare workers now wear clothing that does the job formerly done by walls. So as a result, the grid is the new way. Zoom has shown itself to be somewhat democratizing. City grids have not proven to be so. And of course, images like this of people situated in a kind of grid order are quite widespread now. Again, a recent quote from The Guardian in a piece about how COVID has rewired our brains really inspired me. It said, "Pandemic cues are not organic. They are a series of regularly spaced people being processed by a wayfinding system." And it hit me when I read that quote that that's our new spatial order. That in addition to the kind of one-way traffic systems that we've all learned from grocery stores, or at least in Montreal, that's where we learned how to circulate again, we're now living in these gridded patterns. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and as soon as you look at us, you'll see that we look just like this on Zoom in our gridded composition here today, that this is the new architecture. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Reinhold, do you want me to start?
Yeah, that would be great if you can just go straight. Yeah.
Annmarie, I really enjoyed that. First off, I have to say, and I wrote down a couple of things I think are just absolutely fascinating that I hope we get into talking about in a bit. I don't know that I have as long a number of things to say, and I don't have any slides, but I probably should have brought a couple pictures. But I guess I'll start just by saying my background is as an epidemiologist, but also as a geographer. So I very much appreciate, I'm trained in both disciplines. I really appreciate the GSAPP Center for Spatial Research. And before coming to Columbia, not too many years ago, I was leading the cartographic modeling laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania. And part of our mission there was this purposeful mixing of public health people students and faculty with design and city planning people, students and faculty. And I still take great pride in the fact that we've placed so many public health students in departments of city planning and design and city planning students in departments of public health around the nation. So I think this whole conversation of having us get together is really, really important. I guess I would start by talking a little bit about the main topic of the pandemic. And I guess as an epidemiologist, I'd say that I can safely say that the pandemic's going to end. I mean, it might end unceremoniously. It perhaps will be a quiet finale as we transition to something new and hopefully better, a new and hopefully better normal. But I'm going to add to this and try to introduce another idea to you. The fight against other longstanding viruses that plague us really are other pandemics, violence, hate, and racism. This fight is, by comparison, only really in its infancy. Perhaps people here, many of you have experienced violent hate and racism this past year, maybe this past week, perhaps for much of your lives. And, for that, I really can only say that I'm sorry it's taken so long to even recognize this, much less really start to do something about it. And that we, and I say we, I mean the epidemiology and public health community, we really do need to do better. I've been fond of saying over this past year or so, when many people out there learned what a pandemic was, and in fact learned what epidemiology was, and that it was a science of the utmost importance. I think many people still don't know the word syndemic, and that is syndemic. And that's when two concurrent epidemics come together to basically make things worse for everyone, to exacerbate the burden of disease for all. And that's really what we're in now, this syndemic of racism, violence, and indeed coronavirus. And we're only really making progress on the latter. I'm also fond of saying to reporters, this has been a great opportunity for education, to reporters, community groups, policymakers, and so forth, that epidemiology comes in many flavors. It's my hope and dream that someday we'll have as many epidemiologists focus on violence prevention, anti-racism, and social justice as we do infectious disease epidemiologists. I of course say this with greatest respect for our infectious disease colleagues. But epidemiology heroes are thankfully in the lab. They're working on viruses, including COVID-19, but epidemiology heroes don't always work with pipettes, petri dishes, and pathogens in hospitals and medical centers. In fact, the absolute best epidemiologists also walk our neighborhoods, doing what's called shoe leather epidemiology. They testify in court, they make public policy, and they work day and night to understand and remedy a lot of negative social conditions like poverty, racism, and injustice. And by the way, these are the same conditions that are often the main causes of poor health, not the diseases that are on our top 10 list. So I wanted to put the idea of syndemic out there and then talk to you a little bit about some of the work I've done on what I will call in situ place-based interventions. We've done a lot of work on working on abandoned and vacant spaces, whether those be land or buildings in cities, or work installing public art, and using the same epidemiologic study designs, maybe randomized controlled trials, the same kind of study designs that determined that the Moderna vaccine works. We do this with place-based installations to see which ones have an impact on negative health consequences, health and safety. And we consider safety a health consequences. So, things like very inexpensive treatments to vacant lots and abandoned buildings in our cities, especially our legacy cities across the US, have been shown to reduce gun violence and keep it down by a very significant amount. They've been shown to reduce depression and other mental health issues by a significant amount. And these sorts of installations are what I will call, and we use these as sort of cardinal rules about what to pick to study. They are structural interventions. That is, and this isn't news to you, the structural part, of course, architects and engineers are making structural changes all the time, but for public health people, we seek to make these very basic structural changes to places. They could also be economic structural changes, but in this case, we're talking about places. So structural changes, but we also seek things that are inexpensive and therefore scalable and sustainable over long periods of time. So we are purposely not seeking to create installations like the High Line in New York City and all the negative implications of the High Line that accompany that. We are seeking to create, I think, what one reporter called the Park of 1,000 Pieces, very inexpensive installations that happen and that are placed right where people live so that they can use amenities that many of us take for granted. In the poorest neighborhoods of our cities across the US, legacy cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, that have suffered from a century of structural racism, redlining, and other challenges that have been put upon those cities by their leadership, their elected leadership, have bought into these and created these problems. These same neighborhoods don't have green space at all, have buildings that are crumbling around them. And those are the first distributed, scalable structural changes I think need to be made to give people a basic opportunity to interact with places, to improve their health. And in fact, what we're learning from some of the studies we're doing is that these also change the way people interact with each other. They build social capital, they build social connectedness, they have the opportunity to reduce loneliness and other issues of disconnection among neighbors. And that's the kind of thing that I think, as we're talking about pandemic challenges and syndemic challenges, that really figure into issues of where we can have a big impact, making transformational changes to entire cities, entire sections of cities, and really think about design justice as part of an opportunity to make a lasting change. So that's all I have to say. And I'm looking forward to the subsequent conversation.
So Laura, you can just go straight. Yeah.
All right, so you want me to respond? Okay. Hi everyone. That was, I can't think of two more different presentations in a way. And the one, Annmarie, your presentation is so familiar, not necessarily the Victorian architecture, because I'm here in a loft, too open, much too open. I can hear my husband all the time. He can hear me. When our kid was here, she's actually at college now, you know, they were just the way that your home needs to change to adjust to the pandemic. I couldn't agree more. And if what's going to happen post-pandemic, and we don't know what's going to happen post-pandemic in many cities, you know, I've been saying all the time, if we all have to work from home, home has to change, and home has to change in really radical ways, which then moves over to Charles's discussion. And I say it couldn't be more opposite because, you know, we were privileged to be able to work from home, and I think that's maybe the underpinning of what you're saying, Charles, is that the people who weren't able to, you know, the structural inequality of those who weren't able to work from home versus those who were able to work from home is the underpinning of part of the, what did you call it, the other of the, you know, the violence and the racism that's baked in, right? That's baked into so many of our cities. So we produced a map, so probably I should be the third presenter. And we were actually working with someone in public health. I happened to be at Yale University. I don't know why. I should have been working with people at Columbia. I'm really happy to know you. And we were looking at the social vulnerability index that's put out by the CDC. And as you know, everybody thinks there's so much COVID data out there. There actually is not enough COVID data for us to really analyze what's happening neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, the fine grain of the data. So you can only correct that by looking at social vulnerability and unpacking, the way that the CDC defines social vulnerability into all the 13 categories that includes crowded housing and, many other factors, including race, economics, and, all of those things, which then could have predicted the ways in which COVID spread so unevenly and, affected Black and brown people way more than the ones who were able to safely work from home. So, I didn't know the word syndemic, and I really love that word. And it's interesting because I've been working from the other side, always sort of working with data in this place-based way that you're talking about, both of you are talking about actually, but trying to understand, I would love to know specifically, Charles, what exactly you're talking about when you say you're making these interventions and structural interventions inexpensive and scalable. What exactly are you talking about? Are you working with architects? Or are you thinking more systematically about the percentage of open space in a specific neighborhood, or the overcrowded housing, and the fact that, people in the Bronx don't have a park to go to where they can play soccer versus, high school kids in New York that can go to the East Side and play soccer, in a certain, we did a whole study of a certain neighborhood in the Bronx that just had no access to, they had lots of access to community gardens, and the NYRP were planting lots of trees and things like that, but they had no access to places where they could run around, for example. And then for you, Annmarie, I really want to know more about the Victorian house versus the enfilade. And you're saying that it's middle class, it's Victorian middle class housing. And I imagine you do have some point of view of the things that Charles is talking about, and the large difference between people who are able to have their own private rooms versus the ones that aren't. And, there's geographies that are very relevant here in the United States. And then, of course, I happen to be grew up in South Africa, and, watched what happened there at the beginning of the pandemic. And it was really incredible that because of the infrastructure for the AIDS epidemic, and well, I don't know, it's not a pandemic. Why is it called an epidemic, not a pandemic? You can tell me that later. But because of the infrastructure that was set in place, there was a way in which they could address very large populations, and some much more crowded than others, very quickly, and managed to shut things down in a way that didn't incite violence and things like that. Now it's a little different with the vaccines, because vaccines aren't arriving fast enough, and there's that huge inequality as well. So that's a commentary which kind of I think it does bring both your presentations together, but as I say, they couldn't be more opposite in some ways, because I think that what Charles is talking about is everything that's on the outside, and you're talking about everything that's on the inside. And we all have to deal with that in our own ways from our own multiple perspectives. And I think the three of us on the screen are very equal in that regard. And there's another much larger world that we don't understand, actually, how they've been dealing with the pandemic. And I think what's going on in India right now is a real case in point. Yeah. So I don't know, Reinhold, does that start out the conversation? At least starts
Absolutely.
away.
There's much. In fact, I was just going to say also that there are several very interesting and important questions already in the Q&A.
Yeah.
So we could begin with a response to the response from both Annmarie and Charles. And I also, as we do that, wanted to also add to the frame that Arden began with a reminder to all of us that the context for this is a meeting between medicine and the humanities.
Uh-huh.
Institutionally, the inauguration of a wonderful new major in the medical humanities.
That sounds amazing, yeah.
At Columbia. So that whole sort of problem of the relation maybe here between professional knowledge and practical knowledge on the one hand, and humanistic reflection on the other, and different ways that these frames can intersect and or differentiate might be another aspect to the conversation. So why don't we, if either of you would like to begin responding, I mean, this conversation clearly can just take on a life of its own.
Yeah.
But I would also like to get to these excellent questions from Stephen and Bodan that are in the Q&A. So we could start with with both of you, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to let Annmarie go.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Our guest from outside of Columbia. Oh.
Yeah.
I'm even in another country. Well, thank you, Laura, for those great comments. And I guess I have a million things to say, but I guess the things that came to mind as you were speaking was that one major difference between Charles' perspective and my own is that I'm a historian. So I study the past. And once in a while, I get dragged into the present and asked what I think. But usually I say my crystal ball is fuzzy and I don't really know how to predict what's going to happen from the past. But what I tried to do in my work is to figure out how people of the past thought about spaces, how they felt them, how they wrote about them. And I usually don't. Most architectural historians work on architects' intentions, and I almost always work on user-based histories. So that's something different. But also, I'd like to say something about the importance of the medical humanities. So for 26 years, I taught in a school of architecture, a professional accredited school, and I was even the director of the school until 2015. And then I made a major change in my career and I took an appointment in the Faculty of Medicine. And the reason I did that is because I think the way we're going to improve cities and buildings is to teach people about architecture outside of schools of architecture. For so long, architects and architectural educators have argued that we're exceptional at the university, we're insular, we have to close all our classes to other students because of the studio situation. And I just think we've got to get beyond that. And to make architecture valuable, people have to know about it. It's also, I think, the reason architects are so paid so badly, that there's very low economic value put on architecture. So I'm committed, I'm 61 years old, and I am committed for the rest of my working life to teach students outside of architecture. And I can't tell you how exhilarating it's been to teach medical students about architecture. I teach a course on architecture to fourth year medicine. And because I think that one day they might have to make an architectural decision, or maybe they'll just see hospitals and cities differently. And I just think it's such a good investment in my time.
Yeah.
So congratulations on having your new program at Columbia. And anyway, that's where I think Charles and I really connect.
Yeah, no, I think that's that's really interesting. Teaching other disciplines about architecture. Actually, it's something I do a lot as well. Always collaborations where you bring spatial thinking. And I forgot to talk about we'll talk about the hospital part later as well, because that's so very interesting, your point of view.
No,
Sure, I can, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Annmarie, I just think your comment's so great. And it's so underappreciated, having folks like you come into medical school. So I have to tell you, I'm in a school of public health now, but I spent 20 years in the medical school before this. And my goodness, the School of Design was a stone's throw away, but rarely, if ever, did the two faculties get together. And it's unfortunate. I think we need, and Columbia, same thing, we need to really start, and I know my dean and the GSAPP dean have, ideas about collaborating and getting together, but really public health medicine, architecture, design and planning really do need really transformational things can happen with these kinds of seemingly unrelated collaborations, to be honest with you. I'm trying to think what other comments I had. Well, first, Laura, I have to tell you that you don't know it, but your fellow faculty member at Columbia, Slim Abdul Karim, is responsible for many of those wins in South Africa that you mentioned. Dr. Abdul Karim is our faculty at Columbia and also the Anthony Fauci of South Africa. He just stepped down from his position, actually, but spent the full pandemic basically making those decisions on behalf of I think a grateful nation there. You were asking about our installations and sort of what the content of our installations are. So we do some public art, but not quite a bit. We do some like murals and the implications of having a mural in your community, a public art mural. Again, these are inexpensive things where, for instance, graffiti artists get recruited to come in and do large installations for a community. But the other two things that we do a lot of are abandoned buildings and homes, fixing the facades of these homes. And we actually have a large randomized controlled trial that's just finishing up now on this. And then greening of vacant lots. In cities like Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Detroit and Flint, these have been cities that we've done a lot of work in. And these sorts of vacant lot greenings, if you could Google my name, I'm sorry I don't have pictures, I'm so sorry about that, but you could Google my name and vacant lot greening, and you'll see a number of pictures online of before and after pictures of these. And when I say inexpensive, I mean like $1.25 a square foot inexpensive. These are not, they use processes that are able to change 1,000 or even like a 2, 3, 4, 5,000 square foot space over the course of a day or two. Put a very low fence around that space, inexpensive post and rail fence, leave openings in that space so that the community then has access to it, and put a few trees on it. And what you can do with this is, instead of, these are not really the installation of community gardens or urban farms, that's a different thing, because that is a much more costly thing. So these, where you can do maybe 1 or 2 community gardens for the same cost, you can do 100 or 200 of these sorts of vacant land greenings. And we've worked a lot with, it's a community initiated idea, essentially where community members in some of the poorest neighborhoods and cities around the nation just got fed up with overgrown and abandoned spaces. And when I say overgrown, I mean the vegetation was higher than they were, abandoned cars, abandoned furniture, abandoned appliances, you name it, and also illegal firearms on those spaces and a lot of unwanted activity emerging from them. They just got fed up and basically took over and did some very simple greening installations of their own. This then became a larger program that a few cities adopted and scaled up a little bit. And then there was some scientific study that got inserted into that, showing that it actually did have an impact on people's health to do it, even in a small way. If any of you have seen the movie Concrete Cowboy, which just came out, it's a really nice, you can see some of the spaces actually in that movie. These spaces, again, they're open to the public. People, have get-togethers on them very regularly. They have barbecues, neighbors have their kids on the spaces, games are played and so forth in a very organic way. And in fact, in the city of Philadelphia, some of the spaces are used for horses, hence part of the storyline in the movie Concrete Cowboy. These are very inexpensive, distributable, scalable spaces that are designed for the folks who live right near them. And you can imagine, and I'll end with this, you can imagine if you live on a block where maybe there are 40 parcels on that block, and half of those parcels are abandoned, overgrown, or dilapidated parcels, either buildings or land, and you are able to basically treat those spaces over the course of a few weeks. It's a completely different experience for those residents on their day-to-day as they're stepping out of their doors to go to work or school. They feel safer. We know that it becomes safer and healthier, and then folks start to really use the spaces and connect with the spaces and each other at a much greater rate.
Super. And so when you use the term design justice, is that your own term, or are you quoting a book? Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
So there's a book called Design Justice.
Design Justice.
And the author is
Sasha Costanza. Yeah.
Exactly. So I would encourage many of you to use that. And the concepts of design justice, they play into some of our work, but they also play into a much larger group of a much larger workspace, including indoor spaces as well.
Right. Reinhold, do you know that book?
No, but
No.
I'm happy to.
Yeah. Right. So it's interesting because it doesn't come from architecture point of view. It comes from the tech.
Yeah,
world,
that's what I.
Right. And so Sasha was at the Civic Media Lab with Ethan Zuckerman at MIT. And what I find so interesting about that book is it does come out of the world of tech and the failures of tech to address other people than, white people white engineers, who own smartphones and things like that, and talks about, and again, right, talks about the massive inequality and how you have to change, and it's a very simplified design process that comes from the world of tech to help people think spatially, and it's very systematic, and it goes through these 6 steps, and he takes that on in really interesting ways. But what's interesting about the book is that it's shifted over to just people thinking about it in spatial terms. It didn't start out in spatial ways at all. So I think it would be interesting to just read that book and think about what is spatial and what is not spatial. I don't know. I just find it very interesting that book, being an architect, that it caught on so much. You're the third person in the last 2 weeks that has quoted it from a very surprising point of view. That's not the tech world. So I'm very interested in how that book has been so successful.
Excellent. We have a book and a movie.
Yes.
And so a combination of
yeah.
architecture and medical school and all kinds of. We also have excellent questions kind of in the chat, and I really want to make sure we can get to them. So 2 from Stephen McCarty, 1 from Bodan Arishkevich, and then one from Paul Hake as well. So Stephen, if it's okay with you, I will put your 2 questions together, read them together, and we'll start there, and then we'll go down the chat. I think you folks can see it too, right? So Stephen says, I'm an autistic social worker. I'm curious how disabled peoples who have now more so been confined to the home are involved in these conversations and examinations. Are they seen, for example, as knowledge sources? And then he adds, A more historical question, the argument around hospitals is complicated by the history of mental health. Hospitals have not historically been seen as respite. How do psychiatric hospitals differ? So who wants to kind of take on, these are tough questions.
Well, I can say a little bit from the field of architectural history that disability theory is a huge subfield and growing every day, and is particularly gaining power this year. And again, the Society of Architectural Historians has started a new affiliate group related to some of these ideas. They had a big event, an SAH Connects. So I'm really hopeful that it will become more and more important.
And what do you think about the historical question too about psychiatric hospitals?
Well, yeah, of course, psychiatric hospitals have a different kind of history in that patients were contained in them and lived in them for longer periods. And in the, of course, the 19th century asylum, the kind of Hollywood version of it, was a place to stash away people and hide all sorts of people. So it was a different kind of institution. But I mean, there are other specialized hospitals like TB SANS too, where people lived a long, long time. It's part of that. And I would recommend Carla Yanni's fantastic book on the history of psychiatric hospitals for a better history.
You know,
Yeah,
I don't know that I have an answer, but I just want to comment on something that I love that Annmarie said, is that hospitals should not look like homes. And I have to tell you, I worked in and around hospitals for 30 years, and I've sort of watched this transformation from institution to home. And I've never fully, so your comment was so well taken, I've never fully understood it. And at best, it's always seemed like window dressing to me and not meaningful, and the patients knew it. That said, you want to make people feel comfortable, of course, for their stay in a hospital, but I think your comment is well taken in that the movement over the past decades is to not keep people in hospitals, to have people be discharged as quickly as possible. And certainly in the US, I don't know about Canada, to be honest with you, but in the US, the financial incentives have been structured from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services to incentivize that earlier discharge. And you can see the hospital lengths of stay really plummet in the United States. I'm trying to answer this question. I don't have a direct answer to about psychiatric hospitals, but I do know that the lengths of stay have also dropped in U.S. psychiatric hospitals as a sidebar. So.
Well, also, I want to just quickly interject that there are elements, I think, in both of Stephen's questions and the others coming, that speak to the different levels of our conversation. One is the problem-solving level. You know, there's a problem, there's a crisis, a syndemic, multiple problems, and then professional knowledge, be it architectural or medical or urbanistic, et cetera, is brought to bear on that, and maybe even redefined in relationship to these problems. But then, since this is, I'm speaking to the medical humanities major to an extent here, this is an undergraduate major. There's maybe something underneath this problem solving that has something to do with the posing of the question in the first place, that with which the humanities maybe can help. And so, for example, within Stephen's, particularly the first question about basically what constitutes the public of public health, and who constitutes, is a philosophical question ultimately, but with real world and very practical implications in policy terms, in professional terms, and so on, as we've been discussing. So anyway, I mean, this is to me a kind of opportunity and an interesting prompt to try to balance the what is to be done, how to do it, with whom and why. Discussion with, the sort of like, how do we know in the first place what we're dealing with? That everybody began with in their own presentation. So Bohdan Oreskevich asks, out of our shared experience, but very unevenly so, of lockdowns and so on, after lockdowns and indoor isolation, if not insulation, do we not have to actively encourage rediscovery? So this is a restatement of, kind of what is to be done, of our urban environments for our physical and mental health. To enter the vertical elevator, for example, this is a fascinating case. We need to first explore this is a great, very architectural way to put it. First, explore the horizontal. To understand the vertical, you need to understand the horizontal of our communities and cities. We also need to reconnect with our physical environment, reconnect with our neighbors, strangers, crowds, first outdoors, then indoors. I don't know, maybe Annmarie would say first indoors, then outdoors. I don't know.
Yeah.
This is both a requirement and opportunity to promote more active transport, for example, and resulting health. And then how to do this. So who wants to take on this one? Laura, you're also welcome to.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a hard one, because we all have to start going outside.
I can tell you my quandary. I was actually having this conversation today. There was a great article that came out in the American Journal of Public Health. Oh my goodness, it must be 15 years ago. And the title of the article is Cars Are the New Tobacco. And I think that so you talk about like Glazer's work about density and the importance of vertical living, and there are so many benefits to that in terms of physical activity, in terms of environmental benefits and issues with climate. But by the same token, there are, and I was talking about this today in a New York City context, but there are certain isolating elements of that vertical living if it's not structured. And maybe Annmarie has more to say about this and can help me figure out what an answer is. I think that there are cities where there's more of a connection between your house and the outdoor environment, and therefore with others who are not in your house. I think the vertical living of cities like New York can promote an absence of that connection. And the discussion I was having today is about loneliness as a major epidemic that we're going through in the US and in New York City. And what is it about vertical living that can be, that's potentially promoting this crisis of loneliness that we're experiencing. Anyway, so I don't have an answer. I do know more horizontal sprawl is not the right way to go, as far as I can tell, given the many issues that it has generated. But vertical living also has challenges, if not structured appropriately.
Anyone else?
I'm curious, Annmarie, because as a historian, there's so much written about how the 1919 pandemic was a harbinger of modernism, particularly modernist architecture and light and air, and even vertical living, right? Because light and air and whatever towers in the park and all of that kind of thing. So, architects love to think about these ruptures in history and what is going to be the new response to the pandemic, thinking of it in an engineering way, that there's a problem to be solved, right? Which is part of, I think, the situation we're in now with segregation and, the way in which modernism ruptured various parts of various cities globally, right? So where are we now? For me, I somehow it's hard for me to reduce to the vertical city versus the horizontal city. We've been talking about that for such a long time. So I wonder, I don't have an answer, but I really do actively wonder what the next, how we'll put those two things together in relation to modernism, which.
Well, that's a great question, Laura. And I actually don't think people see the 1918 flu as the rupture. I think they see tuberculosis as the sort of
that's true. Yeah.
catalyst for modernism. And Margaret Campbell's done great work on that. But you know, one of the things I've tried to do in my work is to line up all the big landmark changes in the history of architecture and in the history of medicine and just see if there's any kind of connection. And in fact, it's very hard to see the connections happening at the same time.
Yeah.
So, you know, when antibiotics was developed, there was no huge change in architecture as a response. Historians of medicine always like to think that there is this change, that medicine changes architecture. But my book, Medicine by Design, actually argues the opposite, that architecture shapes medicine. And of course, the real situation is that they shape each other. But I think it's wrong to think that architecture is just responsive to medicine. An example is, like, if you look at tuberculosis, it was almost eradicated, but when streptomycin was developed in whatever it was, 1943, it basically changed the treatment of tuberculosis. And yet there was this enduring sense that chest hospitals and even cancer hospitals later should be connected to fresh air because of that legacy. Like, it was so strong that we thought a chest hospital should have balconies.
Right.
So even after streptomycin, they continue to build them as if they're using the fresh air cure. And then amazingly, those spaces become smoking areas.
Yeah.
So the actual fresh air balcony creates the patients for the cancer hospital. It's just, it's so dynamic the way they feed each other. But you can't actually find those. You know, when the germ theory is developed in 1870, hospitals don't change overnight. The pavilion plan is built until the 1930s. So I actually believe that those slippages show a kind of hesitation to accept these new theories.
Yeah.
And if I could just answer about hospitals looking like houses, because this is something I've been quite obsessed with for a long time. I think hospitals always look like other things. You know, in the 19th century, they looked like castles or orphanages, and then they looked like little town halls, and then they looked like office buildings in the 60s, and now they look like spas or shopping centers or airports. And the reason they look like something else is because one of the functions of hospital architecture is to camouflage the seriousness of illness. It softens the hardness of medicine, that it comforts, it disguises, you know, it fools us. It's a kind of fiction, like a church is. It takes us to another world. So I think it's bizarre that we think the home is the right world. And I just wonder, if, you know, we get, you know, the numbers aren't good in Canada. We haven't had the vaccination rate that you have there. So if we get to a point where there's a sick person in every household, are we going to start to think differently about the home? That's what a lot of journalists have been asking me.
Yeah.
I love that answer, that it's stepping in for something else to mask the seriousness of the situation. I think that's a brilliant response. I mean, I wonder how that attaches to, there's a decent literature about how people do better in terms of recovery, for not for extremely serious, but for many things, by not being in-house, not being in the hospital, that the home is a better opportunity. And it's very small, but there's a growth in home visits. You know, bringing medicine to you rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I think the home visit starts to talk about healthcare versus public health, and that the doctor used to go to the home and see much more, right, than just the patient and their illness, but they would see the whole environment and where they lived and what kind of, right, so it's a much more holistic approach.
Which actually connects me to one of the other points I wanted to make, which I think is a little different than something that Annmarie had said, is when I give this talk, which is often to clinical audiences of physicians, nurses, et cetera, I will end by saying that places really matter, and that it's really important that they understand that the treatment they give their patients when they leave the clinic or the hospital may not work in its intended way if the context or the environment within which that patient is returning to is chaotic and unhealthy. It's basically going to undo the individual level treatment that they're dispensing. And at some level, it speaks to the need for a more muscular social medicine that leaves the walls of the clinic, leaves the bedside, and goes out into the community to make changes, not always waiting for the community to show up at their doorstep.
All right. Well, much more to say, no doubt, on these lines. But then we do have one more question from Paul Hake. This is, I would say, maybe a kind of more general philosophical question, but to what extent is a commitment to social solidarity necessary for understanding both public health and architectural distinctions between public and private space? We could even say social distinctions between public and private space. And to what extent does social difference also need to be recognized for both? So this kind of interplay of solidarity and difference. Anybody who's up for this one?
Well, it's a bit different in Canada, of course, because we think of our hospitals as public space. I mean, they're the ultimate Canadian public institution. So, and we don't have public university, or we don't have private universities either. So it's just, those distinctions are a little bit different here.
So you're meaning it in the institutional sense, and public in the sense of a state-run.
Well, and exclusivity. I mean, everyone is welcome at the hospital.
Right. And what about the difference side then, do you think? I mean, how does such a system address and engage social difference?
Well, it invites social difference. It embraces social difference.
Yeah, well, I don't know what field the person asking this question is from, right? But there's oftentimes a polarity drawn between architects who think of architecture as not being about social space, that it's about physical space. And there's other architects who think the only way to approach architecture is to think about social space and physical space together. And that group of people will talk about social difference as something hugely important in terms of how we conceptualize what different neighborhoods are like in the same stroke as how different people are. Whether or not that translates into something specific for architectural design is a huge open question. But it's something that we think about a lot in the architecture school at GSAPP. It's the one of the biggest debates between people. Yeah.
And most schools have a mixture of those people.
Right.
And so I would find myself definitely on the social side as a trained architect.
Right.
Okay, but I just, for the sake of this, because
Reinhold will jump in here.
The category of space itself, we historians will chime in. This category of space itself is historical, and it seems to be one possible iteration of this discussion would be to substitute, as we have in our daily lives, something like air for space. Yeah. So when we say space, whether it's social or let's say geometrical or otherwise abstract, we may actually mean air. And that, because air is something that we've learned very profoundly and poignantly, we share, but we, in this deeply social way, that gives rise to new expressions or new to the general public, like social distancing or physical distancing, these kind of concepts the term itself, social distancing,
Mm-hmm.
seems to me to put these two questions together around air, social and distance.
Yeah.
Because it's the air that
with
matters.
COVID. Yeah.
In this case, it's the other matter. Anyway, I'm saying that also because the modernism that was being debated, vertical cities for the light and air, and also speaks the language of air. But that language got translated due to the influence of particular formalist art historians and so on, who promulgated, space, time, and architecture and such concepts into a generalized concept of space. And so there is this, I think, a historical dimension to this question. So vis-a-vis Paul's question about solidarity and difference, we're well trained, as Laura said, to discuss those matters in spatial terms, and these bifurcations arise, on a regular basis.
Yeah.
What would it be to discuss these in material terms? That attend to the kind of tangibility of what we call space.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's maybe a rhetorical.
As a related thought, a lot of people in public health have started to talk about reset the idea of social distancing, and that perhaps it's incorrect. And we talk about physical distancing and social solidarity. And I don't know if you've heard that, the combination.
Yeah, no,
Eric Kleinenberg, yeah.
Yeah, but I disagree with that point, because the concept of social distancing is a social concept, and physical distancing implies that this is merely a technical problem. And I understand why, because it like reifies the alienation. But at the same time, we must recognize that the alienation in that amazing image that Annmarie showed at the end there, and of the screen, this screen itself, is socially produced. We have designed this alienation, and as a social relation or non-relation, as the case may be. Meanwhile, Paul has responded, Laura, to your question. So I think we owe him the recognition that he works at the intersection of comparative literature, media studies, and architecture urban studies. So there you go.
An undergraduate, and yeah, okay, that's great. That's a great combination.
Answer, yes.
Right. So if with that in mind, it's not a surprising question, right? But it's one that you need to put together yourself in a way. Like I don't think there's a direct answer. I think it's part of the debate of how we define the relationship between social space, physical space, architecture, politics, all of, for me, the question is, it's what I engage in every single day. So.
Yeah. There. Public health in relation to solidarity, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, but I mean, since this line has continued, and thank you, Paul, for pushing on this, because I also wanted to kind of explore the solidarity aspect of this question, because what you've all been discussing in different ways are our encounters with fragmentation, alienation, the divide that Laura mentioned between those of us who can work in interiors and those of us who are asked to work to do what so-called essential work outside or outside of home. On our behalf. We could even point to this question in the intimacy of the elevator. During those, that time that the elevator was starting to reshape cities, there were human beings in operating those elevators, and they were marked socially, racially, and in gender terms also differently than those with the privilege of standing there basically and asking to be taken to the 30th floor. So there are social structures inscribed in our on our spatio-technological ones, let's say, and so on the solidarity problem. Because solidarity is not something that has shown itself to be a kind of given in these circumstances. Sometimes quite the opposite, although sometimes surprisingly, for some of us, might be a little less sanguine about all this. Certain solidarities have arisen, and some of those are passed through state institutions like public health and public medicine. Others do not. So what could we say about, let's say, sites of solidarity in relationship to these questions?
Sorry, say that again. Sites like SIT?
Sites of solidarity, like as a kind of, let's say, a counterpoint or an antithesis to the structured alienation that has become so visible, that has always, been there, running in the background of our social lives, but has become so, deeply visible in these interiors and the grids and all the rest of it. So the empty squares.
Mm-hmm.
Well, social to me means relationships between people, but also relationships that people have with their institutions. Now, I say that institutions can be public or private, but I'm wondering, maybe from the Canadian experience, how are those institutional relationships and how are those the institutional to people relationships brought to bear to enhance that solidarity or to drive that solidarity in the wrong direction? Are there opportunities here beyond simply trying to engineer things that bring people together always in terms of more solidarity and connectedness? And I think you're using solidarity and connectedness as similar or related concepts here.
I'm just trying to be faithful to Paul's question, but I would distinguish myself, at least, between those. Solidarity seems to me a kind of more like a commitment, to someone who's not you,
Yeah.
to whom you might not be connected, in a immediate social sense. And I think you're kind of modeling that, frankly.
Almost like a collective efficacy that a group would manifest.
Right. That
Yeah.
certainly. Yeah.
Commit to, or
Yeah. But certainly also in terms of the syndemic that you described earlier, Charles,
I would say that public health in relation to solidarity, the most difficult aspect of that right now is vaccine equity, right? Where we know that the health of everybody in the world would be better off if everybody had access to vaccines. And there seems to be simple ways of having that happen, but it doesn't happen. But that's, for me, that's like if the US had a solidarity that went beyond its own borders. I don't know. I'm just trying to answer the question in relation to public health, rather, because I think of solidarity in very different terms than how that would spill over into a discussion about public health. But the one place it does seem so simple is to break the patents and all of that. It seems such an easy thing to do.
I'm trying to dig into Paul's question a little bit more. And I as a comment, I think it's been very difficult for a lot of public health leaders and a lot of public health authorities to execute policies that frankly were necessary, but that could potentially undermine solidarity and social connection.
Yeah, that's an interesting contradiction. Yeah. As we head towards the finish line here, we have a couple more questions from Yanis Tsilikakis, and I'll again try to put them together. The second one refers back to this discussion, so I'm sure we'll loop around, but so maybe I'd start with that. Yanis is a bit puzzled about what solidarity means here. It can only be expressed in this principle only to someone who is considered kin. I don't think that that's necessarily an assumption in this conversation, but and proximal, nor is that, and the vaccine example that Laura just gave, the kind of solidarities that would require, would be well beyond proximity and kinship. But if we want solidarity to extend beyond the parochial, we need solidarity squared. Yeah, solidarity of solidarity. However, I'm not sure to whether that's something that means anything substantial. Solidarity. But then prior, Giannis asks, how can we make medical buildings look less like prisons? Now, I don't know, maybe there are connections, there probably are, between these two questions, but this is something that we in architecture, the prison as paradigm, in effect, from hospitals to housing, it comes up very frequently as a sort of negative case. So for example, with more window space, openness, is it the profit motive? Which wants to maximize space as the arbiter? Should we be quitting the massively centralized hospital facilities for more humane, smaller scale, more in number, more geographically dispersed, like churches, for example? So I suppose we should begin with Annmarie, if you want to, because you brought this up initially too.
Yeah, well, actually, don't see many hospitals looking like prisons that have been built recently. Some hospitals of the 1970s maybe look like prisons. Brutalist hospitals, for example. Some people think they look like bunkers. I actually love brutalism, so I don't have any problem with them. But I really think it's a generational thing. You know, that's the sort of finishing point on the home versus hospital question, is that I think my generation, this is a generalization, of course, my generation finds the strong architecture of the hospital quite comforting, that it's a place that's going to like fix you and magically heal you. If I were really, really sick, I would want to go to one of those big 1960s hospitals where they just do things and make you better. Whereas my students' generation don't see it that way at all. They really hate those places. And they like, you know, birthing centers with flowered bedspreads and wood paneling and pitched roofs and kind of domestic craziness. So, but I think hospitals now look like shopping centers because of the rise of the patient consumer, and because many people find it like normal to be at the mall. So it normalizes being really sick, to have a hospital that looks like a place that you might go to consume something. So
I keep coming back to the question of health versus care. And if you pay more attention to many other things in the environment or a neighborhood or a community, there's a lot of things that can happen before you go to a hospital that are structures of care. And so I don't know, saying like the churches or, things that are more dispersed. It's even healthy food in a bodega, or healthy, clean water, or, outdoor space. There's so many other structures before you get to the hospital.
Right. The question was about prison hospitals, so that's why I talked about hospitals.
Right. No, I'm talking about the dispersion part of the question. Yeah.
Well, of course, the price of technology too is one of the arguments for centralization, but maybe the pandemic will be an argument against centralization. So in Montreal, we've just abandoned all the hospitals and all the main teaching hospitals and built 2 super hospitals. So it's super centralized.
I know. It's huge, yeah.
Yeah, 2 huge hospitals. So everything's there now.
And the pandemic will be an argument for, and already has a huge opportunity for telemedicine.
Yes.
Okay, so I think that's going to be a huge shift in what we do going forward. There were some health systems that were dabbling in it, and then suddenly now every health system has it as a main focus. And there's an old public health saying that health is not merely the absence of disease. And I think most people don't understand that the medical system is a subset of a much larger public health system around the world. And that really the medical care, while necessary, is last resort. And to Laura's point, public health, a much broader way of thinking, is obsessed with preventing disease before it occurs in the first place and promoting good health, not simply waiting till something happens and opening up a structure that is going to make you feel good about getting care. And that's a mindset shift. That is actually, Canada is much further along than we are in that mindset. That is a mindset shift that the United States, which is still our biggest line item in this country, is our medical care line item, which overwhelmingly goes into our hospitals. So until the US can get past that and start to adopt more of a public health thinking, we're going to continue to have these conversations about, more and bigger buildings designed to wait for people to get ill as opposed to nipping it in the bud.
Well, our conversation, I think, now must conclude, but I did, in deference to our hosts, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, ICLS, and the new Medical Humanities major, I wanted to invite just very briefly all three to offer any closing thoughts on this concept of the medical humanities and how, how that might be defined, understood, whatever tensions might constitute that, as well as possibilities it might represent in terms that we've been discussing or in others that are meaningful to you. So just to salute ICLS and medical humanities. Any thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Charles.
Oh, I was just going to say, it's been a joy learning from you all. Yeah. I'm a product of a liberal arts education, so I rarely get these kinds of conversations. So thank you for inviting me.
Well, thanks for coming. I think this could go on in all these different ways, and I think, just to speak in translation a little bit from the ICLS conversations and so on around this topic, that the problem of the problem, let's say, of defining that problem, grasping it, the terms in which, and the language indeed in which it's grasped, verbal or visual or spatial, to use our idiom today, is not, is something to study and to reflect upon in concert with and perhaps enriched by this both practical and maybe more philosophical ways of addressing the problems that we've been grappling with this evening. So right on the dot of 7:30 here in the evening, it probably is time to conclude and to thank you all for your generosity in the conversation and in response to the questions of our audience, to be continued, surely. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Really nice to meet you both as well. I'm going to look you both up. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay.